Welcome to the IR Global podcast. IR Global is the largest international professional services network. I'm your host of the IR Digital podcast, Jennifer Riggins. Today is the first in an exciting three-part series we are doing with guest Jessica Brown Wilson, all on the Me Too movement, or you may know it as hashtag Me Too movement, and sexual harassment and assault in the workplace. We're going to have fun with this, even though we are talking about a very serious topic. We're going to try to make it as actionable as possible. And we're just going to be reflecting on the almost 2 years later since its start to see if anything's changed, and particularly the modern view we can take on human resources and employment law around it. Normally now I would say who should listen to this call, but pretty much everyone I think should listen to this call. I think it is very clear it affects everyone, whether you've been in the situation, you had a friend or colleague in the situation. Being aware of how to deal with this is useful. Today, Jessica and I will be talking about how to create a sexual harassment policy that actually makes for a safe company culture. Yes, Jessica is an American lawyer, so there will be American laws, but pretty much it's going to be really helpful for people from any country. You may need to factor in, of course, the law of your own country, but Jessica's a partner and employment lawyer at Fisher Broyles, which is in the US, and seems like an awesome law firm with a good company culture to work for. But I think it's something that everyone can learn from, so I hope everyone enjoys this call. So Jessica, hello. Why don't you start by telling us a bit about your background?
Hi. So I am like you said, I'm a partner at Fisher Broyles. My expertise and practice is centered around labor and employment. So what that looks like on a daily basis is that I help businesses navigate any and all kinds of issues related to their employees. So sometimes that's drafting policies. I'm actually working on 2 handbooks right now. Drafting agreements, when there's sticky, complicated situations that arise, helping them kind of work through the facts and the risk. And then, when our plans don't always go as planned, in the situation where an employee files a lawsuit, I defend the companies.
Okay, great. This is Me Too tangent, but ironically, I asked, of course, as I do habitually with some of these podcasts, I asked, okay, I'm going to talk about this topic. I tweeted out on LinkedIn, what questions should I ask? Because, of course, I write my own questions, but it's always good to get ideas. And I did have a really good question, but everyone responded with, ask him. And I was like, oh, please, come on now. We're past that. Let's be grammatically incorrect and use they. That's fine. But I was just amazed that I only had white male responses and they all said, ask him. And I was like, oh my goodness. So I just thought that was a little bit of real life that I'm sure you get often, sadly. We just like mama calls the doctor and the doctor says no more, and we're supposed to use a masculine deep voice, no more monkeys jumping on the bed. But no, we have to break those habits. So listeners out there, I just had to mention that. So let's start. For anybody listening that's maybe lived in a bunker somewhere and doesn't know what the Me Too movement is about, what do you think was the turning point? What happened? Why do you think it's hopefully still a hot topic now? I'm not sure.
Well, the Me Too movement really kind of took a place on the map, in 2007. And so people, I guess we should give a little bit of background. So it started out with a hashtag, like hashtag Me Too on social media, and it was to demonstrate the widespread prevalence of sexual harassment and sexual assault in the workplace. And Alyssa Milano, who's an American actress, was kind of the one that really made this go viral and kind of exploded. She encouraged her peers, women that are celebrities and women, just all women, to come forward and share their stories. And it happened, all of a sudden women were online sharing things that had happened to them at the workplace that they'd never shared anywhere or with anyone before. And so this movement has it's definitely made some ripples, some pretty big ripples in the workplace, and just, how we're handling things, what we're seeing, which I think all in all is a good thing.
Okay, and I think that's good. I think it's a good thing. I think we can all do better. And hopefully it's the start of something bigger. It's definitely filtered off into splintered groups like nuns too, which brought about some things in the Catholic Church, which was crazy that we didn't know, and was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But is that in every industry. So hopefully we'll see it across the board, because certainly in the legal profession, in hospitality, in politics, where I used to run campaigns, wow, #MeToo. Today's episode, we're definitely going to focus on being very actionable. First of all, when we're creating a sexual harassment policy and basically policies to create work a more welcoming place, a really good question someone asked was, does a written policy actually change human behavior? Does it decrease in any way the amount of assaults or violations by having a policy, by telling people, oh, you shouldn't sexually harass your colleagues?
Well, that's a great question. So a written policy by itself that is handed to an employee, and the employee probably doesn't really read, and they just sign it their first day of employment, I would say that written policy does not do much to help the environment or change the situation. To really be effective, the company has to take on what is written in the policy. And so, that looks like orientation, where someone is actually talking to the new hires about what our policies are, how do you report, what are the examples of what is sexual harassment, what is retaliation. And then I think a third thing that's really important, that is kind of the new trend now, with 5 states currently in the U.S. have required sexual harassment training for employees. And I recommend it for all my clients, because there's just something about, sitting and having to have your attention focused on something for an hour and actually learning what this is, as opposed to, stale pages in a handbook written and handed to someone, and they, it's either emailed and they never look at it, or, they get a hard copy and they toss it aside because everyone's busy and no one wants to read long legal documents. So to sum up, a policy in and itself is probably not going to do much. It can do something in the world of defending a lawsuit. It does something. But if we're talking about really changing the culture and eliminating sexual harassment in the workplace, then there needs to be more than just a policy.
That's a great way to put it. The goal of these policies are basically eliminating sexual harassment, and of course also other types of harassment, things like that. That's very interesting. So when they have this requirement for some sort of training, does it have to be in person? I know my only real corporate job, I had to take an online course, and I was like, and I know a bunch of guys actually went in a room and took it together and crowdsourced the answers for their test, which also gave me insight to how they did at university. But does it have to be in person? Is it a personal situation, or?
I can speak to 2 states. So the 5 states that currently require sexual harassment training are California, Connecticut, New York, Delaware, and Maine. There are other states where laws are pending to require it, and there's another set of states that quote unquote encourage sexual harassment training. Most of them do not require it to be in person, so online is sufficient. My personal opinion about online training is, it's just a slightly different version of handing someone a written document that they're probably not going to read. There's just something to be said about in-person, actual human having a conversation, so people can ask questions and actually, listen. There's some accountability to actually listening and hearing what the message is being delivered.
That's very true. It's definitely more memorable that way to have something in person, or even if it's a remote or distributed team on a video call like we're on Zoom right now, but something face to face in a way. What other mistakes besides onboarding with sexual harassment policies? What other mistakes do people make when addressing sexual harassment in the workplace?
Gosh, I feel like that's a loaded question. So the mistakes are that it's not taken seriously. Is like if there's a complaint, and even if, you know, it's Jane who complains every day about something different every day, and you're just like, as a manager or as an HR professional, you're rolling your eyes because she's always complaining about something. But if she's complaining about sexual harassment, you have to take it seriously, you know? And so I would say that's the biggest issue. That's one of them, not taking every single allegation, every single complaint. I mean, anytime someone is saying something about it's the opposite sex, or, you know, they asked me out or they made me uncomfortable, you know, there are some kind of red flags that you've got to listen for. And I think this is why it's important to have specific training for managers and executives, so that they know on a different level when they receive a report or when somebody's communicating something to them, the employee might not even think about they're reporting sexual harassment, but what they're communicating is in fact some information about potential sexual harassment, you know, how to listen for that, and then what to do, you know, next steps. And kind of the next steps vary depending on how large a business, right? If you're talking about a small business that has 25 employees and may not have an HR department, they probably handle that differently than a large publicly traded company that, you know, has a very robust HR department and, you know, lawyers on staff.
How does it work? Because it feels like it can be a very he said, she said, or he said, she said situation. How does that even work? If it's in writing, if it's like the text messages of the now outgoing Puerto Rican governor, okay, we got screenshots. Like, we know what he was saying. But if it's not in a written form and there aren't cameras around, like I guess in London it would be a lot easier to prove because there seems to be CCTV everywhere, versus the US, which seems to have more of a respect for privacy situation. Comes both ways, ups and downs of which is better. How do you address something like that? Does it start with a conversation? How does that work?
Yes, it starts with a conversation. So usually what I advise is that whoever is taking the information, will just say it's an HR professional. The person that has the complaint, like, even if the complaint is written or tiny or whatever, they've got to take that seriously and what I call conduct an investigation. Now, an investigation is a wide, broad range of what that could be. On a minimum, you want to in person talk to, if possible, in person. I always recommend in person. Talk to the person who's making the complaint or the person that was affected, the harassee, and the alleged harasser at a minimum. If there's indication that there are other witnesses or other information, you know, when you're talking through the person that's making the allegation, you would ask, you know, do you have any evidence? Do you have any proof? Are there text messages? Are there pictures? Are there emails? Can you please send that to me? Because as a company, you want all the information, right? You don't want any surprises. Like, you want to really uncover and get to the bottom of it. And it may seem like a big pain in the butt, but it's a much bigger pain in the butt if you don't take the initial complaint seriously and really get to the bottom of the facts.
And it's the right thing to do. So what parts make up a useful sexual harassment policy? Because I guess you do the training and you need a policy. You need both.
Right. Yes. And so there's not a per se like legal well, in California, there's a legal requirement to have a sexual harassment policy. In most states in the U.S., there's not a statute that says you have to have a policy. But in the case law, under Title VII, there is a benefit to having a policy because that's a way of proving that your company is not, sexually harassing. You don't have a pervasive environment of sexually harassing people. You have a policy and you set out that, you train people. Before the Me Too movement, though, it was really kind of like a check the box. Most companies were like, yep, we got the policy. Yes, A, B, C, D, check, 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 check. But did they really embody an environment that sought to eliminate sexual harassment? Maybe not. So the question about what makes up a good policy. I like to start off with a strong zero tolerance for sexual harassment and just kind of give a big, a couple paragraphs, and then explain all of the categories, because usually these policies are inside an employee handbook. So you're not just addressing sexual harassment, you're addressing other types of harassment and discrimination like race, religion, disability. And then I usually do like almost a page of bullet pointed examples, not like interesting examples like that happen, but like, unwanted sexual advances, visual conduct such as leering and making sexual gestures or displaying or posting sexually suggestive messages. So kind of, I do like bullet points so people can be like, oh, okay, they have more of a on the court, this is what sexual harassment looks like, because I think that term, and although we use it a lot, there's not a lot of context to it generally. And then the last part is I always include a pretty hefty portion about retaliation. So letting the employees know, this is what harassment is. This is what you do if you observe it or you know of it or it happens to you. These are the people you contact to report it. And then finally, you're protected if you report it. You will not be subject to retaliation.
Do you outline who to report, because it's often a superior, a person, maybe your boss, who is the perpetrator of sexual harassment? Is it outlined where to report, like in a small business that doesn't have an HR rep versus, I guess, in a large corporation, you would almost always go to HR, right? How do you, I think it puts people, the victims of, or the alleged victims of sexual harassment in a vulnerable position at times. So
I agree.
That outline who you can report to, or?
I do, and like you mentioned, it varies by the type of business, how big it is, what their makeup is. I usually, so a mid-size to a large business that has HR, I'll say, report to human resources with a name and an email, or you can report to your supervisor or any other supervisor or any other member of management. Is usually, to give them options. Sometimes I also put language in, to someone that you feel comfortable reporting it to. A lot of companies have anonymous hotlines where you can report things like sexual harassment or other types of issues that an employee may feel pressure, uncomfortable reporting, even in an email. They want some anonymity. And I find that to be really valuable. I've had some clients that are not that large employ that, and I think it's a great way. I would encourage, if it makes sense on a cost basis, I think it's great for companies to have that option.
Is it then difficult to prove or follow up, because someone could say, oh, someone was just pranking me, or the boys club mentality of like, or does it actually work that it's quite actionable even if it's anonymous?
In my experience, just like any complaint, if you're doing what you're supposed to do, you have to take it seriously. So I guess I can give some kind of real world example. I have a large publicly traded client, and there were a couple anonymous complaints related to an executive, a high level executive. And so because of the sensitive nature and the high level executive, they asked me to come in and do the investigation for them so that it was completely objective and, there was no bias towards the leadership accused. And so in that situation, I would say, that company did all the right things, right? They took it seriously, really did a robust investigation to find out what are the facts. It depends on what the complaint is, right? If you get a one sentence complaint that makes no sense and seems a little weird, it's hard to take that seriously. But if it seems like a legitimate complaint on a hotline, I would say, best practice would be to really follow through and do an investigation.
My best friend actually at the university she works at brought up this question, which is mandatory reporting, because she works for a public university in the US and she has to report it. So what is mandatory reporting and how does it work? What are the benefits or possible drawbacks of it?
The way I usually draft policies, I write that it's mandatory. If you have knowledge of sexual harassment, if you witness it or you're a victim of it, you're required to report it. And that's because we're not going to get to a point where we can eliminate it unless we know what's going on. And so it's while I guess it could sound a little bit harsh, it really, if the company doesn't know it's happening, the company can't do anything about it. So I think the purpose is to encourage this dialogue and the open communication about it, and kind of we've had a history of this happening throughout the workplace, for decades, and no one says anything, right? It's just you keep it to yourself. You don't report it. You don't say anything. So the mandatory reporting, I think, is one way to try to alleviate that.
And how does it work if something is reported and is proven true? How does a company decide disciplinary action? Is it usually in the sexual harassment guidelines? Because it does seem to vary dramatically depending on what position you have in a company or what rank, especially perhaps in, people that own entire massive media conglomerates may get massive severances, things like that. Is that part of that built in? Can a sexual harassment contract policy be actually built into someone's contract?
The laws are slowly changing. California is always at the forefront of making employee-friendly laws to where you can't hide those type of settlements, sexual harassment settlements. You can't hide those anymore. Used to, there could be embedded confidentiality agreements like with Harvey Weinstein or something like that, so that, the few people, the lawyers that drafted it, the people that know how much money was exchanged, are sworn to never discuss it. But as far as the discipline, like how to discipline, it's really a case-by-case, fact-driven situation. You want your policy to read in a way that it's clear that violations of the policy, I usually just say violations of the policy may result in disciplinary action up to including termination, because you just can't have if this, then, if A, then B, if C, then D. It's really not that black and white. So if you are in a situation where there's been an allegation and it's partially corroborated, or maybe it's not completely corroborated, my advice is usually to write up the person that's the alleged harasser. That way, as a company, you've got a written documentation that you had a complaint, you took it seriously, you investigated it, and you communicated it to the person, and there was some kind of discipline, something happened. And then, if it happens again, then my advice is always immediate termination. If it's a situation where you're corroborating really serious bad behavior, then obviously that would warrant immediate termination.
And if there's something about like an assault, I guess the business has to contact the police, is obligated for, if it's a legal issue, or is it the obligation of the alleged victim to contact the police?
I think it's the obligation of the victim. I mean, that's one of those like slippery slopes, depending on the facts. But that is a possibility. If it's, serious sexual assault, then it's an issue where the police would potentially be involved.
And would be driving it, I guess, would be driving the conversation, or?
Well, not really. A police investigation of sexual assault and a company's investigation of sexual assault and sexual harassment are pretty different. I mean, they obviously overlap with the facts, but the police and the prosecutors, their job is to determine if the crime is violated and the statute is different, and prosecute the perpetrator. Whereas with a company, I mean, depending if a lawsuit is filed or not, but I'm assuming if there's a serious sexual assault, there's also going to be a civil lawsuit. And so the legal standards are different. So, and in my experience, there's not always a lot of sharing of information between the criminal investigation and the criminal case and the civil. I hope that there would be more collaboration, but in my personal experience, there has not been a lot of working together.
Are there actually, so you've talked a lot about state laws. Are there federal laws in the U.S. against sexual harassment in the workplace or any type of workplace discrimination?
Absolutely. So sexual harassment, as we know it, really came out of Title VII, the Civil Rights Act, which it prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex, and that was starting in 1964. The term sexual harassment didn't kind of flow through and come out of that until about 1975. But the crux of the laws on gender discrimination and sexual harassment all came from federal law. And then the progression has just been that some states have been a little more proactive and progressive in certain specific areas. But there's certainly, yes, this is founded in federal U.S. law.
And our laws, is there also a trend for sexual harassment against gender minorities and gay, lesbian, non-binary people, things like that? Is the law progressing even in California to cover things like that, even use of pronouns? Or still?
In California, certainly, yes, all of those gender nuances are protected. Under federal law, it's still, it's an interesting issue because there are a few federal courts that have recognized lower level, not the Supreme Court, that have recognized sexual orientation as a protected class. But federal law generally has not gone all the way to clearly, say that transgender, queer, all of the other nuances of gender identity are protected. But there's a basis for that protection in the law. I think the law is written broad enough to protect it. The case law is just not really specific right now that it clearly covers it.
but hopefully soon. Hopefully we'll see New Jersey on the list of having a legally required sexual harassment training, my state, and things. I think we can all do better, but I do think that creating a policy is the starting, and having the conversation as a company of how you want to make a welcoming company culture and environment. And even before you start writing the policy, having that discussion, I think, is important. Is there anything else I should be asking you or that listeners should know about this topic?
Anything else? I would just say, if you're in leadership in a company, or you've got the ear of someone in leadership in a company, this is not like a crazy liberal progressive thing. Like, this is really the way that the workplace should be, right? We should have workplaces that are free from sexual harassment. And so I would just say, really taking that on, not like joking about, oh gosh, the eye roll of sexual harassment policies. And that's so silly, because it really is something serious. There are statistics that, at least 25% of women in the U.S. have experienced at some time sexual harassment in the workplace. So, it's a serious topic that I think deserves real attention.
And it just ends up benefiting the company because you have a more inclusive and diverse staff, and you retain that staff, which means that you actually have more success. There's a direct link to productivity, monetary success, everything in the books for being more diverse and inclusive. So
absolutely. And you're, reducing liability in the instance of lawsuits. So
that's true.
Win-win all around.
It's a legal situation for sure. Thank you so much for taking the time today, Jessica, in the first of a series of what I think are going to be great conversations. And thank you, listeners. Be sure to check back and listen to it for the second and third episodes that'll come up in this series. We're going to focus on how to treat employees like humans, even if you're disciplining or terminating them. And then finally, for the employees listening, which I guess is the majority of the people because you're an employee of someone, how do you know if you're being treated unfairly at work? What can you do? We want to empower you. So thank you so much, Jessica. These IR Digital podcasts are meant to be educational resources from experienced lawyers like Jessica, accountants, and financial advisors with extensive knowledge on the topics you as professionals just simply need to know about. To learn more about IR Digital and its services, visit irglobal.com. And if you found this episode useful, please consider sharing it. I think it's definitely one that it benefits a lot of people, and we want to broadcast it further. So Jessica, if our listeners want to touch base with you to learn more about you, Fisher Boyles, or any employment and sexual harassment law in general, what's the best way they can contact you?
You can contact me via email at Jessica, JESSICA.Wilson, WILSON, at FisherBroyles.com. It's FISHERBROYLES.com. And we'd be happy to help you with any questions.
Great. Thank you so much for taking this time, Jessica.
Thank you.